Hey, welcome to the Story Studio podcast. Today we're going to be talking with Vered. I'm sorry, I don't know how to pronounce your last name.
Ehsani.
Ehsani.
Yeah.
About culture. She lives in Kenya and has a lot of African culture in her books, but we're going to talk more globally about culture and all the things to know, sort of like world building, what do you need to consider, and how can it enrich your books. So welcome to the show, Vered.
Awesome. Thanks. Good to be here.
We've had Virid on the show before, and those of you who may remember her as like a hugely productive author. She caught our attention because she's just a really good learner and doer.
And she laughs loud and exuberantly.
Oh my God, the best laugh. Yes.
Hard to miss that.
Very loud.
Fun to eat with. So not everybody's fun to eat with. You know, some people are like, Dave's fun to eat with, but not for the right reasons. It's because he's so not fun to eat with, he circles around and he's fun again.
Well,
Right?
she's specifically
love
fun
eating with me.
She's specifically fun to eat with for people like Sean and I who need our sense of humor validated. So when somebody laughs at us, like other people wouldn't care, but we do.
Right. No, she's laughing at the jokes and loving the smoked beef rib quesadillas. Like, it's just a really good party. It's really good.
Oh man, I miss going out to eat.
Yeah.
Remember those days when we could go out to any restaurant and eat?
Yes.
Oh my God.
Yes, I do. But Virid also always does. And so it's great to be curious and always want to learn the new thing. But a lot of authors use that as procrastination, including me, including a lot of us. So Virid's always just doing the things that she says she's going to do. And she currently hits Cheese Whiz every day, pretty much, which means 5,000 words or more a day.
Wait, is that it? Cheese Whiz is 5,000?
Yeah, Cheese Whiz.
No, I missed that one.
So Cheese is 10,000. Cheese Whiz is 5,000. Virid hits Cheese Whiz pretty much daily, unless she's on a beach, which she recently has been, and I think she's still hitting it. For the most part.
Cheez-Its.
How many is Cheez-Its? 2,500?
Yeah.
It's like 5 or 6 words.
All right.
Sounds good.
Cheez-Its is good. And even just recently, we had a really cool new strategy that was like, oh, we need this kind of book and it needs to be this kind of length. And I think she's already started it. And the idea was 2 weeks old. Same with the last thing that she wrote, which was learning a new style. And she totally did that. So she's always just really pushing herself and her art, which is awesome. But kind of the core of what makes her stuff special is that it is culturally and geographically distinct. So Virid, let's start there and just talk about the why behind that. Like, I understand the geography of it. That's kind of where you live. And it's a really interesting, I think, marketing hook, because it allows you to reach a very specific audience with a voice that no one else is going to be able to mimic or match. You know, you're talking about a very specific cocktail, who you are in that time and place. But culture is a whole different thing, you know? So why is culture a really important thing to pay attention to in the stories that we tell?
Okay. So culture, whether we know it or not, we are incorporating culture in our stories. So it happens regardless. But if we're not thinking about it consciously, what can happen is that we create this, it's called the world of hats. I don't know if you've ever heard that expression. I heard it for the first time with Sterling and Stone, actually. And it's basically this world where everyone has the same, it's homogenous. It's a homogenous culture, all these aliens wearing hats. And in reality, well, that's just not part of reality. Even if you go into what you think is a homogenous culture, maybe you're going into like a town where everyone's coming from the same background and the same ethnicity. But even within that, you're going to have subcultures pop up. And if you can capture that in your stories, it just enriches both the story generally, the world, and also the characters. And it allows you to create some very distinct twists to each character that are natural and resonate as authentic.
Can you give us an example of a TV show or movie, some common vocabulary where that's done really well, and then an example of where it's done really poorly?
Okay, so most TV shows and movies don't do it well. or they do it very, or I shouldn't say they don't do it well. They do it from a very, it's a very narrow perspective of what culture is. So a lot of the mainstream movies and TV shows we watch are very much American centric or Eurocentric. And so a lot of the audience maybe listening to this would think, oh, well, that's normal. But there's one movie, it's not a mainstream movie, but I love it. It's called Bride and Prejudice. So it takes the traditional Pride and Prejudice and Bollywoods it. And it's absolutely brilliant because there's enough of the original, Victorian English culture in there to resonate with any audience. But the Bollywood flair to it just gives it a whole new life. And then you also have some characters who are very American or very British. And so they're kind of being thrust into this alternative reality. And it's a lot of fun. I'm just trying to think of sort of mainstream movies that work. And I'll have to think about that and get back to you.
Do you think that it's getting better? Like, I mean, compared to some of the shows that we're seeing now, I feel like it's on a definite positive trend. Is it fast enough? Maybe not, but I feel like streaming, especially because it's more democratized, right? There's more content that needs to be created. And so there's more audiences to serve, and audiences can get niched down. So you see these tiny little shows.
Like The Watchmen, for example, we watched this as a series together, a group of us. And The Watchmen, to me, captures or makes a really strong attempt to capture different cultures within a single culture. So you have, this town where you've got, a typical American town, and yet there's a lot of layers of history and race and subcultures that come into it that just play out beautifully. And that to me gave a real spice to it, a flavor that I don't find in as many TV shows, but definitely it's happening more. Yeah.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Well, I just wanted to ask for a clarification. So how much are we talking about? Because I think there's sort of two ways you could consider culture when I'm hearing this. One is the inclusion of cultural considerations within any work, which is sort of what it sounded like you were describing. And then there's shows that are specifically diverse in and of, not that they're diverse. They're like, okay, so here's what I mean. So Sean, I think you mentioned Never Have I Ever, which we're watching now too. And that's, the family is Indian. It's very Indian.
I was just thinking of that show actually like 30 seconds ago.
Right. So that a show like that almost feels like an answer to me of, and actually Master of None did some of this too in some of their episodes. It felt like an answer to the Indian population isn't represented very much. So here is, a story that's about Indian people. But that's a show like that isn't a whole lot more diverse than a show about white people. It's just about Indian people. So are we talking about considerations within sort of a large mixed cast? Or are we talking about specific stories of cultures, like a lot of yours are very African, obviously, or are we talking about both?
Okay, so I'm talking about both, but what I'm particularly thinking about is not about, you see, what you're talking about is cultural and racial representation, which is its own thing, and it's also very important. But the things I'm referring to are a little bit more subtle. So I'll give you an example. In The Watchmen, you had these people who were all living in the same town in the same larger American culture, and they had experienced the same history together. But some of them had experienced that history in a very different way. So their approach to life, their approach to conflict and to specific situations is going to be quite different. The way they react, how they think actually is different. Even though if you were walking through the town as an outsider, you wouldn't notice those things. Well, if you go into, Delhi, you will notice, oh yeah, I'm in a different culture. But some of the cultures that I'm talking about are much more subtle. It's more about within the same, like a cast of people, you could have physical diversity, but I'm personally more interested in the mental and emotional diversity.
It's like behavioral dialect is what you're talking about almost. Right?
Yeah, that's definitely part of it. Yeah.
And so I think who does this the best, because Johnny, you're totally right. That really is. Then in that episode, it's like the non-characters of color become like characters of color in another show. They're there to kind of accent, right? There's
very few white characters that aren't background characters in that show. So it's very, very Indian.
That's the problem with America today. There ain't enough white people on TV.
In all seriousness, Dave, that, like, I know you're making a joke, but that's actually sort of what I'm thinking of is where is the line where, like, some people are going to feel that it's pandering to, not me, not us, but some people are going to feel that that's like, Dave's neighbors are going to be like, well, that's pandering. And it feels like what
They don't know words like pandering around here.
They don't know pandering. That's too many letters. Is it dog? Is it cat? It feels a little bit more like there's another purpose other than diversity for diversity's sake. It's more like seeing something from two sides. So when you mention Watchmen, there's the real like the basically KKK type of characters, although I forget what they called them. They called them something else. It's what was the group called in that? The racist group? They had the masks and stuff. I don't remember.
I know who
Rorschachs?
No.
Well, that was the name of the masks.
Something.
Yeah.
Was it
it's Cavalry, the something, Seventh Cavalry?
It's Cavalry with a K.
Okay, so whatever, KKK basically. And so those people, even when they're not being super racist and they're just being like amongst themselves talking, they're going to have very different perspectives than some of the black characters who experience the exact same things. And so it's almost like considering sides as opposed to spotlighting a culture.
Yes, but
exactly.
I would actually say Watchmen isn't the right example, because Watchmen is a show that culture was part of what it needed to do. Like it was one of the themes. It was one of the important things that it was putting out front and center, where what I think we're talking about is just an evolution of story to where it's more authentic, it's more natural. It doesn't have to be put front and center because it just exists. Yeah. And I think if you look at Netflix, I mean, it's definitely a positive trend, but I think it's more data driven rather than art driven. So, it's a different form of pandering, but it's more like, hey, we've got the data to serve this audience. We're going to serve that audience. It's a different sort. But I do think, they're like woke flicks. They definitely are. They do have a mind to that. But who I think is really crushing it in a I don't want to say a more genuine way, because it's awesome that Netflix has their eye out. And like, if you've seen some of the stuff that they're doing with, I don't know how to say her name, but Ava DuVernay, she did a Netflix documentary called 13th about the 13th Amendment. That's just amazing. And she did that show. It's 4 parts, and it's called When They See Us, and it's about the Central Park 5, and it's amazing. It's just really, really great stuff. So Netflix is supportive of that, but HBO is just better. They've been doing it longer. So and yes, Watchmen is HBO and it's impressive, but I'm much more impressed with their High Maintenance is a good example. That's just a show that's like, by the way, no big deal. It's exactly what we're talking about. No one is pandering, and yet it is the most inclusive show I've maybe ever seen, because this guy is just selling weed. And sometimes he's selling weed to a bunch of gay people, and sometimes it's a bunch of black people, and sometimes it's like this room full of like super 5-star general feminists who are just like telling him, wait, stay back there with your masculine energy, as he comes in with the weed. So it's like they're just part of the background. Or another show that I recently saw, Betty, that's just about like these young teenage women who skate around, skateboard New York, right? It reminds me of that show or that movie Kids from '93. So it's just like snapshot of New York, and it feels real. And that's the thing.
That's the point, is the realism. It's not about, it's not about, let's include some people, some people who aren't usually represented specifically to,
it's not about
it's about creating realism.
Yeah. At the same time, it's interesting because there is this, and I agree, Netflix has done a really great job. They have different languages and different cultures that are highlighted. And that's actually really important because, for example, there's a lot of authors, I have a lot of Kenyan friends who are authors, and when they look at, what's on the top of the charts of books, of movies, of music, they will hear American or British accents, they will see predominantly white faces. But when they start to see people who look and sound like them, it empowers them to now create their own story. So I think it's also important that that's happening. But I definitely, when I write, I'm not trying to write from, an African's perspective or from a Kenyan's perspective. I'm writing from my own perspective, but I'm trying to make sure that my characters are not me. And then I know that sounds obvious, but I'll give you an example. So one of the elements, I wrote a draft book called Creating Culture, and one of the elements that I explored is about access to utilities and how that impacts your own particular culture, family, individual, and neighborhood culture. So I grew up in Vancouver, where Canada's a water-rich nation. I think it's got the most amount of fresh water in the world of any country. Vancouver, at least was when I grew up, was like just water was literally pouring everywhere. There was just like fountains everywhere, and people didn't count showers by the minute; they counted it by the quarter of an hour, right? Like it's just like water was just everywhere. It was just free. It was easy. It was just there, and that creates a culture, if you like, of water wastage. So the way you treat your utilities, your resources, is going to be different. Come to Kenya, and it's a water scarce nation. So I once spent 4 weeks. It was a week after my second child was born, though there was a huge flash flood that knocked out our dam for the Nairobi, and we had no running water for 4 weeks. So we had to collect rainwater as it was, whenever it rained. It was the heavy rainy season. So whenever it rained, I'd run outside with buckets to collect water, and that's how we managed for 4 weeks. It was like literally like rainwater collecting in buckets and then putting it in our bathtub. And when you do that for 4 weeks, like your whole thinking about water and about your lifestyle and everything just does like a 180, and the way you treat it is so different. And there are people who are living like that all the time, who don't have running water from a tap in their house. So when you start to think about things like that and start to integrate that into a character's persona, it really creates a beautiful contrast to, say, someone who doesn't even think about water as an issue. That's one example of what I'm talking about.
Okay, so help me figure out how to problem solve this, right? Like, let's say I'm not somebody who, I'm not going to say it's easy for you. I'm going to say it's more
present for you,
right? You are somebody who's traveled around the world. You, again, like, you're part of our studio because I think 3 different times you crossed the Atlantic Ocean to come to one of our events. And so you are very used to traveling around the world. Like that is a big deal, right? Dave needs to pop quite a few Xanax before he'll go to KFC or whatever. So it does make a difference that you have that experience. So like, I mean, Dave and I have talked about this. It is one of the limiting things in his writing is that lack of perspective. So how do you do that? If you're an author, because a lot of authors are introverts, a lot of authors don't travel. So how do you do that? Is it watching documentaries? Is it just being aware? What is the way to get more life experience so that because what you're ultimately going for is believability too, right? And if you're not used to going to like a really rich person's house, for example, and you don't want to describe it as it looks like I walked into Architectural Digest, how do you get that? How do you get that experience?
Yeah. So you mentioned a few things like watching different shows from different cultures, and that's becoming so much easier now. Documentaries and shows that are directed by different people and people of different cultures and backgrounds and whatever. But also, and again, yes, we are introverts, but making the effort, if we go to the store, whenever we do start shopping again, oftentimes, like, especially, if you're a white person, you're listening to this, oftentimes the people who serve you or who even drop off your Amazon delivery, or you go to the shop to pick something up, many times the people who are on the other side of the counter are going to be different from you, even at a socioeconomic level, and oftentimes on a cultural and ethnic level as well. Like having a few conversations with those people, like just asking them like how they're doing and, so what's going on in your life, getting to know the person in the corner store down the road.
Should you do that with a microphone, like right in their face?
Yeah, and I'm going to be recording. You don't mind, right?
Right. Just take out your phone and go to voice memos and set it between you.
Actually, I did that for once. I did a radio show for a year interviewing African artists, but that's a whole other thing. But I think if we really want to deepen our art, we do need to take risks, and that means getting a little bit uncomfortable to talk with different people, and not to talk with them, but to actually listen. Something that I see a lot in the world is that people are talking a lot, but they're not always listening. So when someone is describing to you, for example, my daughter, when she was little, people would come up to her and start stroking her hair. Okay, so we have a bit of an inverse situation here. We're like the minority, we're white, we're very much a minority. So we get pawed all the time. In certain places we've gone to, we've been like the only white people in an area, and people are like, what, who are you? So as an adult, I could handle that. But from my very young daughter, it just freaked her out. So she became really adverse to anyone approaching her and touching her hair. So now I think, well, what if I was growing up in this like 3rd, 4th, 5th generation where people always felt it was okay to come and paw my hair? how would I then react if someone comes up to me and goes, oh, you have such beautiful hair, and reaches out to touch me, right? So it's about really listening to the dialogues that are happening out there. It's about getting out of our little social media ghettos and actually following someone who maybe is of a different stripe, a different, political persuasion than you are, and being okay with that, and not going in there to try to prove that they're wrong and that they're an idiot. Like, this is sort of how this very, polarized situation we have in the world, where if you're not on my side, then you're an idiot and you're ignorant. That's actually not true. There are really smart, intelligent, educated people in every single space. So put aside your own prejudice, well, almost every space. So to really just sit there and listen without judgment, without having a need to respond to anything, that is a great learning exercise as well. And you will pick up a lot just by like reading people's comments on different articles, going into different media spaces that aren't naturally your media space, breaking out of your ghetto.
But here's another thing, and I'll cue Dave up for this because, he can elaborate. But I think one of the things with Dave, it's not that he doesn't want to discover this stuff or add textures to his voices and character experience, but I think there is a little bit of resistance. And I think this isn't just Dave. I think this is probably for a lot of people, where if you're like, what gives him the right to speak on behalf of someone else's culture? And so there might be like a hesitation, like, I don't want to get that wrong because I don't have that experience. So how can I kind of co-opt it and pretend that I have the authority? Like, Dave doesn't even want to get police procedural stuff wrong, where like, that's not about, someone's not going to take that personally. They may be irritated, but cultural stuff is personal. So if Dave wants to get everything right, and we talk about controlling the camera, well, you're the director, dude. But if it's that with procedural stuff, when it gets too emotional, there's even more resistance. So is that right, Dave?
Well, I grew up in the hood. I had lots of Black friends and Spanish friends. So I'm pretty, I would say I have a good feel for a lot of different cultures, at least from South Florida, where I grew up. I think my resistance, and I do feature like many different races in my books, but I don't try and write like, the definitive Black or Spanish or Asian experience, because I do feel that, as a white dude, like I see like super woke liberal people like, just, how dare you write that? That's not you. You're appropriating a culture. Fuck you. Go back to your corner. Write only white dude stuff. But if you only write white dude stuff, then you're also going to get shit on. So I try and write, I try and write without appropriating somebody else's culture or offending anybody. But at the same time, being inclusive. And I think there's a fine line for me anyway. But I'm writing, I don't know.
Well,
so I have a question for you. Just go ahead. Because again, we're assuming culture means different ethnicities and races. I recently proofread one of your books, Dave, and it was actually quite. I was anticipating like this dark horror, but it actually wasn't nearly as bad as I was expecting from a horror perspective. But your main character was a woman. Mm-hmm. You're not a woman. And women.
Wait.
I know, it's shocking, right?
I've been working with him for 11 years now, Dave. When were you going to level with me?
When were you going to tell him this, David? No, but seriously, women have a very different subculture than men do. And within women, there's going to be different subcultures, whether it's based on ethnicity, religion, sexual orientation, political orientation. So the minute you write about anyone who's not you, you're already entering into a cultural fray.
I've actually been told that I write women and I write women and lesbian women very well. I've been told like I probably because a lot of my friends are women and some of them are gay.
You're not a lesbian either?
Well, I am a lesbian.
How disappointing. And David, your character came off very authentic. My point is this, that you were able to write about a woman and in a very different space than what you are, because you have a lot of familiarity with women. Yes. You have women friends, right? Mm-hmm. So I'm not asking you to now represent all women. You can't. Like, if you tried to represent all women, you would have like at
Oh
least
my
3
God,
million women
Dave,
screaming on your
please
neck.
write a book called Representing All Women.
Yes.
But my point is, like, you can't represent all women. You can't represent all white men even. So you're not trying to
I wouldn't
represent
dare to.
anyone.
No.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's the sequel, right?
It's called I'm
Representing all
Sorry.
white men.
Yeah, I think I've had a few thoughts that are popping up here, so hopefully this doesn't sound like a bullet list. The first is, and this is sort of by the way, but you're going to get shit for whatever you write, because we're suddenly, like, we're built to interact with, what is it, like 100 people or something, whatever that monkey sphere number is. And we're interacting with the whole world, and that's just not normal. So like 7 billion people get to weigh in if they want, if they have internet access.
Yeah, I'm recalling a specific conversation I had with an author, which he told me that exactly half of my characters in every book needed to be women. And I was like, really? What if it's a story about
Stand by
a
me.
group of men? No, it's got to be all women. So, like, there's some people that you will never please, and I don't try to please those people. But
Right. So that's one thing. The other is that it occurs to me that, I mean, the way that I would approach this, and I don't know if you guys are going to disagree, is, so if I wanted to include a Kenyan, and I wanted to represent that, you know, the water disparity that you're talking about, if that was something culturally that I felt I wanted to offer to the book, I would not have two characters talk about the water politics or whatever, like conservation. I would probably have that Kenyan character, when he's washing his hands, go and like turn it on and get my hands wet and then wash it, you know, turn it off before. I would do like water conservation that would be above and beyond what an American would do. And I don't even think I would mention it unless it made sense,
No,
because
it's
to me
more
that
just
feels
being
like calling it
aware of
out.
Yeah, it's being aware of their personal history. It's ultimate show and not telling.
Right. And you've, I mean, the touching of the hair was really interesting. You know, that's the sort of thing that you might just kind of do. And I think calling it out is just like, hey, look at me trying to be diverse. And then asking, like, putting a target on yourself if you get something wrong. But if you just
actually, this is a really good point, because there's something sometimes about, and we talked about this too, where I was saying that Dave, I can feel his timidity to step in this. Here's actually a really good example. We have a character, I mean, this is in a couple of books, where it's an African-American female. And but he'll have the, you know, she doesn't like her hair to be touched. And he'll not just describe that with body language, which is enough. Like, you could leave it at that, but the character will explain it to the reader. I don't like it touched because of whatever. And a couple times in the book, and he's explaining it so that there's not much liberty, or he's explaining it to himself, or it's almost like this is here for a reason, but you don't need to give the reason, because the action is enough.
Well, it's that thing that we've talked about before, where in a sci-fi book, they don't sit there and think about how the door opens. It's
okay. The only one I remember specifically, I think, was Emily's List. Are you talking about that?
No, also Jordan. Multiple times, like there's 6 books in that series. We have at least 6 mentions.
Yeah, but okay, well, that might be a little bit much, but I think with my characters, like, the internal monologue is a big thing, and I'd have to see what you're talking about. But
right. But what I'm saying is the one mention maybe is for the reader. Anything more is for you.
Well, that's probably just me forgetting what the fuck I wrote.
Right. But what I'm saying is, because you're so in tune to, is this going to come off okay? It's almost over explaining, right? Johnny will do it not in cultural stuff, but just in information. He wants to make sure that this is clear to the reader, so it'll come up a few times and they'll forget. Oh,
I know that. I think that for something like that, I think you know when you're getting into, maybe somebody should check this territory. So I'm thinking of the military characters that I wrote in the last book, where after a few mentions, I was like, maybe we should run this by Joel.
Yeah, Johnny actually left a comment that said, and military is a great example. That is a whole culture. Like, that is an absolute culture that, and to Virat's point, within there's a bunch of cultures. So you've got military culture for women, versus male versus white male. Like those are all different subcultures, right? Officers versus enlisted men, very different cultures.
I'm curious, how do you one thing I do struggle with, you know, as a white guy, if I'm writing a character that talks like friends I had when I did live in a hood, it might come off quite racist, because if they're using a specific slang and I'm writing it that way, it's like, oh, he's saying all black people sound like that, and that's not what
I wouldn't worry about that. I think you're overthinking those things. There are going to be people going to be pissed off. I mean, as Sean said, like, no matter what you do, there's going to be someone who's going to like go down your throat for that, right? They could also do the same thing about your women characters. Like, well, no, I'm a woman and I would never do X, Y, and Z. Well, good for you. You wouldn't. Yeah. And I understand that race in your part of the world is a bit more of a sensitive topic. So even leaving race aside, leaving skin color aside, even if you have a group of characters who are the same skin color, same eye color, even whatever, even within there, you can nuance things by adding different culture. For example, one aspect, and people might argue this isn't culture, but I think it is, and I'll explain why. Neurodiversity is a huge thing. Neurodiversity is not even like what you think, it's actually how your brain processes information in the world. And so, for example, like my son has Asperger's, and my daughter is like highly emotionally empathic and highly emotionally intelligent. That's like two opposite spectrums, like unbelievable. And so when they walk into a room, the way they process a room is so thoroughly different that you could not, if you were writing a narrative for each one of them, you could not write the same narrative. Like, it would have to be different. Now, is my son representative of all Asperger's? Of course not, because every person is individual. So, you know, you can always come up with some reason not to explore a new character type. But I think if you do have like concerns about like, especially like something like the military, which is very, very specific, then yeah, you probably do want to get an expert opinion to like read over those scenes. But there's a lot more leeway. Like most audiences aren't that, you know, they're not going to drill down and say, well, an Asperger's person would never notice that. Well, my son did, so whatever. So I think it's okay to experiment and play. And if you have concerns, let someone else read it to see if it strikes them as authentic, and not to be scared, because this is actually part of the problem in the world. People are so scared that no one is exploring each other's realities. And we actually need a lot more exploration of the way different people think and experience the world. And we can't do that if we all stick to our ghettos. So the only way we're going to change that is if we start experimenting and taking risks. And yeah, sometimes we're going to get like a 1-star review saying, well, I'm an African-American and I would never talk like that. You know, you think all of us are uneducated? No, you know, but that's the reality of the place you grew up in. So.
Yeah, I think that what tends to get you in trouble more often than not is generalizations. So if you're implying that one particular character talks this way, that's different from implying that all particular characters who look like or grew up like that person talk that way. It's the recognition that, you know, somebody who's Egyptian living in the US is not walking around all day being Egyptian, right? Like, it's like they're
walk like an Egyptian.
Right,
right, they're interacting with everybody else. Like that's important, that you aren't defined. I know I had, I thought seems so obvious, but I had a gay friend tell me once, he said, wouldn't it be nice if I could just be Scott? Right? Like, instead of just being like the gay guy in the group or something like that. And so, you know, I think that you can get away with a lot just by acknowledging that there are differences between everybody.
I think that I think TV has greatly like even in the 70s, like when you had shows like the Jeffersons and Good Times All in the Family. Yes, those shows, even though some people might say they were racist. I don't think Norman Lear was particularly racist. I think he tried to bring people together. But I think those shows for very racist white people coming out of a very segregated, you know, 50s and 60s, saw black people with like the same problems as them, the same everything else as them. And then like later shows did the same thing with gay people, showed how more we have in common than we have apart. So I think like stuff like Netflix airing films from, I think one of their things about inclusivity for like foreign language stuff is just they're already creating stuff for that. So why not bring it to the US, subtitle it, maybe dub it, I don't know, whatever. I think the more that you see of that, the better it is for all of us to see how alike we are more than we are different. And it helps to bring people together in a way that, you know, wasn't able to be done before when we were living in these bubbles of our own little societies.
What are the commonalities between culture and world building? So
commonalities and the differences.
Yeah, so I'm going to talk about the Beam for a second, which is one of my favorite worlds that we've ever put together as a company. And I'm going through the original for the first 3 seasons now to, you know, think about what's coming next. And there's so much culture there. Now it's not about race, but you know, there's a lot of language that is adopted. It's what we made up, right? So all of our culture there is world building. There's 2 political parties. You're either enterprise or directorate. Those are very different cultures. You're either enhanced or you're not. Very different cultures. You know, you either have a lot of money or you don't, and those are very different cultures. And having money isn't necessarily the same as your political affiliation or whether you're enhanced. They are all individual cultures, and yet because I think we really wrote with an eye toward believability that these little cultures and subcultures exist, I think that's one of the things that really makes that world work. So for us, we had to cheat because it's sci-fi, right? But we're talking about the same things that we would be talking about if it was, you know, a story set in our real world right now. I mean, it couldn't be the same story, but obviously, you know, those characters, those problems, those issues, the things that we're talking about are human things. So what is the overlap there?
Okay, so the way I would describe it in a nutshell is that world building is both hardware and software, while the culture is just the software. So I'll give you a practical example. Let's say we have a world where everyone owns something that looks like this, right? And they use
holding
it
up a
to
cell phone.
Yeah, that's it. So they use it to communicate with each other, to entertain themselves, and that sort of thing. So the hardware is the phone, but our attitudes towards it, our attachment to it, our dependence on it, and what it does to us, you know, when we come together, you know, we come together to eat, you know, dinner together, and all of us are sitting on our phones or not. That's the cultural part. It's how we interact with technology, for example, while the world building is, what is the technology? What is it used for? You know, how did it get there? Like, it's that kind of stuff. So I think in the Beam, it would be like the cultural stuff would be, how do these different groups interact with each other and treat each other and people who are within their own groups? That's the culture. But how it all happened and how it's enforced, that's more the hardware stuff. Like, oh, there's, I don't know, there's, you know, machines that make sure people don't cross certain lines, or there's reporters or whatever it is, right? So that's how I would distinguish between the two. So hardware, yeah, so the world building includes culture, but culture is a subset and it's very specific.
Interesting.
Bonnie, do you have any questions about culture or?
Actually, I do have a question. Garrett, I loved your book on culture, and I think it's really unique. All the other books I've ever read on culture for authors have been very focused on world building, like how do you decide what the government's going to be like, and how do you decide, you know, like what the religion's going to be like. And I love how you made it so personal, and it was so much about how individuals interact with each other. So my first question is, when you're thinking about building characters, how do you choose the elements of that character's culture that you're going to want to express in the story? And also, how do you think about bringing that out through culture clash and making that feel very natural and feel like it's part of the interactions?
Okay. So fantastic questions, of course, from Bonnie. I don't expect anything less. So the way what happens generally is that the characters kind of appear almost like they naturally will fit into a certain culture or subculture, and I don't impose it on them. So, you know, for example, when I was writing Society for Paranormals, which takes place in colonial East Africa, the main character is, you know, a British white woman, because I felt that was the easiest way for me to interact with the story, because it was more naturally who I am. But or my perspective. But the other characters just naturally like, you know, it was just very natural. Okay, this person is going to be Kenyan because he can't be anything else. Like, he has to be this. And then, you know, he's going to come from, and then some of the decisions were much more like about, okay, how will this move the story forward? So it actually works better if he's from this tribe versus that tribe, because this tribe lives in this area and has these issues and mythologies, and this guy, that wouldn't work. So some of it is about just naturally who the character is, and then some of it is what will make the story work the best, and also to create interesting interactions between them. I think a lot of cultural clashes, so to speak, some of it is verbal, but a lot of it is much more nuanced. So there's a scene where, and this is again, this is very stereotypical of what I see in a lot of movies about that take place in Africa. So you always have these, like, the main characters are usually these, you know, white European or Americans coming in to either save the day or, I don't know, do something. And then a lot of the background characters are kind of very subdued and whatever. So I played with that. So one of the characters is the gardener. And so when he's in front of, you know, the boss, he does the typical stereotypical, you know, yes, sir, no, sir, but keeping his eyes cast down. And that's how you see him, as very subservient. But as soon as the boss walks away, there's a whole other dynamic that comes out as he's interacting with the other characters. And so this Miss Knight realizes, okay, there's more to this guy than just the subservient gardener. So you can do fun things like that, or let's say, you know, you have two characters who are walking into a situation, and, you know, one of them is observing, like, oh, you know, there's this dynamic between these people, and the other one's like, the food smells great, doesn't it? Like, just totally oblivious to whatever else is going on. So so without even describing, like, this person is very British and talks about the weather, you can just do it just through a natural
and it's one of those things where once you understand the culture, and it's way better to just show and not tell, and not be worried if somebody doesn't get it, like, why are they doing that thing? Like, it's fine, because you're writing for the truth of the story, not for 100% of people to understand the story.
Yeah.
And you're not writing with a political agenda, I'm assuming, too, which is also
important.
Well, I think the bonus there is, like, you know, if the person doesn't understand, they're like, well, that's just one of their eccentricities. But if the person is British or whatever, they're like, oh yeah, he got that right, or she got that right.
Okay, exactly. I have another question too. How authentic should you be? And what I mean by this, I won't say what the project is, but we were talking right before we got on about a specific project and how unique the voice is for this project. Like, it has to be super specific. And now there's a lot of reality layer in it, but it's also kind of like a hyper exaggerated reality. And oddly, within that hyper exaggerated reality, it's actually toned down a bit. So there's like respect paid to the culture of this topic, but not like blind allegiance to where it destroys the reading experience, because ultimately you're telling a story and the story has to, you know, be front and center. So where is that line where, like what Johnny was saying, you don't want a political agenda where my allegiance to the reality matters more than the story. So where's that line?
Yeah, I think the first thing, before we can talk about where the line is, because the line will shift. It will depend on the story and the situation and the characters and the genre and all of that.
And the audience?
And the audience to some extent. Like mine tend to go like a little overboard. Like, I have no problem doing a bit of exaggeration because it's so much fun. And that's the kind of stories I write. But I think part of it is to get comfortable with...
You mean a cultural element that you just kind of amplify?
Yeah, like I amplify things. So like some of the interactions maybe wouldn't naturally happen back in, you know, Victorian England, like Victorian East Africa, because colonials were very like, black stay there, white stay there. Like there was not a lot of interaction.
It tells the story, and it allows the larger things that you're able to say. It's you controlling the camera. I've got this story to tell. My reader is going to trust that I know what I'm doing, and I'm going to tell them that story without getting
Exactly. So I do recognize and acknowledge through different interactions that there's this reality that's being imposed on everyone. But at the same time, my characters find ways to subvert that reality with comic effect. But one of the things about that line is also, as writers, to be comfortable with being uncomfortable. So for example, like one of my characters in book one of the series, you know, she's coming from England, and she's like hardcore, you know, she's white, British, proud to be British, part of the British Empire, and the British Empire is saving all of these wretched savages around the world. And, you know, that was the attitude of the time. And she perfectly embodies
that was really
that
nice
attitude.
of them to take care of that, though.
I know, wasn't it? It's awesome. But
that's what we do in America now.
Yeah. Now, yeah, always 500 years. But,
manifest destiny, bitches.
So this character does that. She talking about manifest. She manifests that part of the story, of the history, and it's part based on historical reality. So she is like, I mean, she meets this basically what we find out is a god, and she treats him like a porter. She's like, oh, finally the porter's shown up. I hope he's better than the last one. You know, like really like if you almost want to cringe, but if I couldn't have written it any other way, because that's who the character is. That was the history. That was what happened.
Well, you also have to bring, we don't live then, right? So we have our modern sensibilities that we're bringing into your story. So exactly. you can't tell the exact story that you would then, because it wouldn't land. You have to it's like meeting your customer where they are, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Right?
So to balance that in that scene, to balance like her obnoxious behavior, you have the main character is just like cringing, going, I'm so sorry. I can't help being related to her. So it immediately makes the reader feel a bit more comfortable that, okay, I'm not the only one who doesn't like this scene. Right. But it still is honest.
If it was at the time, you wouldn't have a Rachel Green in that scene. Right?
No,
but
exactly.
You could have a Rachel Green, like we know that character, we know how she's going to respond. So if you write her a little bit like Rachel Green, we've already seen that scene. So even if it's less believable, we actually believe it more, because the stories train us what to look for.
I also like Vered's point about having the other character who's reacting. Because I've thought a lot about this, because sort of our attitudes and culture have changed quite a bit over the last few years in the US as far as some of this stuff is concerned. And, things like people like cringe watching Friends. People will say, I don't cringe watching Friends because that was at the day, that was just kind of how it was. And
how you doing?
Yeah, it was just kind of the way that was authentic to the time. But I think the reason that sometimes things get like the cringe factor like that, like, oh my God, I can't believe we as a cultural supported whatever thing, is because the creator, you can tell that was, they're endorsing it. You know, when Joey is super womanizing and it's just like, ha ha ha, and the laugh track goes, and, nobody's reacting like maybe that's a bad thing or something like that. And you compare that in my mind to something like It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia, which is still on, and it's lost some of its punch for sure, but they still take some pretty big swings, because it's clear that those are farcical characters that are meant to be reprehensible. Like there's, other people in the scene are reacting to how terrible they are. And that's different from just like putting something together where it's just like, here's a story, and it's clear that I think this is awesome and funny too, even though it's offensive or something like that.
Exactly. So there's the line. I think it's about respecting the audience enough, but also respecting the story, trying to find the balance between the two, and trusting your audience. Like I've never had anyone write a review or write me an email saying, you racist SOB. Like no one has ever done that. Everyone has said, oh, the characters are really authentic. I love the history. Like it just felt very immersive. And that's what I was going for.
Like that's a serious question. Like I actually don't know that.
Have I what?
Have we ever had a review that has called us racist for?
We had a review of, I think it was in Yesterday's Gone, when we described an Asian woman, but we didn't describe, they said we didn't describe the other women. So basically saying our default was white unless we stated otherwise. So I don't know how accurate it was or not. I don't know. I'm more aware of that and try to.
Yeah, I'm more aware of that now too.
I know we got shit from both quote unquote sides with the Tomorrow Gene, because I think it's on the very first page.
Oh yeah.
Our black protagonist is noticing that there's one other black guy on the train he's taking, and that's just a noticing that he has, but that points out that these characters are not white. And so we got a few reviews who were like, oh, look at you pandering and going out of your way to make sure I understand that your protagonist is not white. And then we also got people on the other side saying that, well, you pointed that out, so therefore, you're the other way around. You can't please everybody. It's just
we have gotten hate mail saying even having gay characters in a book was shoving homosexuality down their throat. I like when people use that, as their
Dave
thing.
literally did shove homosexuality down a character's throat in season 2.
maybe that's what they meant, Dave. Maybe it
I'm
was a
just
literal.
saying.
It wasn't for that book, though. Yeah.
Yeah, maybe they read White Space and then just went to another book and was sure you were guilty of it. That seems pretty memorable, dog.
Yeah. Oh, well.
Final thoughts on including culture? What do's, don'ts, any anecdotes, jokes, witticisms, observations?
I'm not sure there's any do's or don'ts, except just be thoughtful about it, and don't. And I think if you're doing it with the intention of making your characters authentic, not doing it to force a false representation, like, oh, I'm going to show that I'm inclusive and I've got Black people and white people and gay people, like. It comes across as fake, and it kind of like, and I think it kind of rubs people the wrong way, at least does me. But if you have, authentic characters who happen to have these, different traits that come out through natural interactions, then that's great. Like, you don't have to worry about offending people, as long as you mentioned before, like, don't make it like, well, all white girls are like this. Well, yeah. So I think it's more about just being true to the story and being respectful and really wanting the best for your characters and your readers.
All right, cool. Well, we will wrap this up then. Thanks, Vered, for being on. What was the culture book that Bonnie mentioned? Is that
it's actually
out?
not out
Okay,
yet.
it's not out yet. Okay.
It's not out yet. It's called Creating Culture, and I'm sure Sterling Stone will let everyone know once it's out.
Coming soon to a stone table near you.
There you go.
I have no idea when. It'll be there.
Well, you can actually, if you're interested in that, you can actually go and sign. I have another link for you. You can go to sterlingandstone.net/stone table, because that's the list that we would tell about that book, for instance.
That's a smart link, John.
Smart link. So thanks,
I'm a smart guy.
I'm just trying to stay on
Intensely
top
smart.
of it. Just trying to. That's my culture.
There you
Grew up
go.
with intense people. All right. So thanks everybody for listening, and we'll see you on the next show.
Adios.
Cheers. Bye.